I'd like to share with you two epiphanies that I've experienced on my journey here to St. Mark's, to this stage, and to being a badass life changer. As you heard from that lovely introduction by Peyton, I was a lawyer before this. Since I was 6 years old, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, always. And often when I was growing up, you could find me in my backyard prosecuting the neighborhood kids for numerous transgressions. More often than not, the little boy who lived across the street, David, he ate dirt a lot. So I prosecuted him for eating dirt a lot. He had to be brought to justice. And actually, one evening I forgot that I had incarcerated David in our garage and didn't remember until after dinner when I could hear his mother calling from him from across the street. Yeah, that was not a good night in my house. My mother was less than impressed with my antics, but I think she appreciated my sense of justice. But interestingly enough, this dream to be a lawyer was almost derailed when I was 13, and ironically enough, by a teacher. It was my 8th grade geometry teacher, and I loved her. She was my favorite teacher, and I don't do math, but I was enjoying it. And she asked the class, she said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I grew up in LA, so a lot of the kids were, "Oh, I want to be an artist or an actor or a producer." Some said doctors or firefighters. And I said, as I always said, "I want to be a lawyer." And she immediately turned and she said, "Jeniene, you'll never be a lawyer. You can't do a simple geometric proof. How can you be a lawyer?" I know. I will say this. A, I still don't know how to do a geometric proof. And B, I have no understanding of the correlation between those two things still. And for any aspiring lawyers out there, I don't think there is one. So don't worry. But anyway, I can laugh about it today. But at the time, that was devastating. So I went home and I told my mom that this teacher had said this, and how upset I was, and how, my God, I'll never be a lawyer now, I can't do a geometric proof. And my mom is brilliant and funny and the wisest person I've ever known. And she said, "Nene," which is what she called me. She says, "Nene, it's your dream. Hang on to your dream. And if she's a teacher who cannot inspire you to fulfill that dream, find a new teacher." So I said, okay. So I stuck that in the back of my head, but I won't lie, I have hung on to that fear that because I couldn't do this one thing, I was going to fail at this other thing my whole life, my entire professional life. But I moved on. At 16, I studied the civil rights movement, and I thought, I don't want to just be a lawyer, I want to be a trial lawyer. I want to be a civil rights lawyer. And I want to be Thurgood Marshall. I want a Brown v. Board of Education decision as my legacy. And I tell my mom this, and she's like, "Sweetie, that's your dream. Go make it happen." And my mom had broken numerous barriers in her life. She wound up being a head controller of an accounting firm in Los Angeles, and the first Black woman to do multiple things. And so I felt like I had this legacy to live up to. And so then I went on to law school, and I studied constitutional law. And I thought, the way to make change, I think, in the world may not be as a trial lawyer, but rather on the bench. Because to give power to the powerless and to pull forward the marginalized and give voice to the voiceless seems to be better made from the bench. So again, I changed my dream. I narrowed my dream. And I told my mom, and she says, "That sounds awesome, sweetie, just make it happen." And then I graduated from law school, and I thought, you know what? I think I don't just want to be a federal judge, because one day, the president's going to appoint that first Black woman to the Supreme Court. Yeah, I know. I'm narcissistic enough to say, why not me? That could be me. All right, why not? I have lofty goals. So that was my trajectory, and that's what I did for years, and working toward that goal. And then something cataclysmic happened. This is the first epiphany. I had my son. And I know it sounds so cliche, but the doctor handed me my infant boy. And I realized at that moment that I had been doing it all wrong, that I had been living my life internally all this time, and that it had nothing to do with me becoming a Supreme Court justice. And it had everything to do with me ensuring that my son, should he be so inclined, could become a Supreme Court justice. Now he's sitting over there, right there, looking at me going, thanks a lot, Mom. No pressure there. But that's what I realized that's what I wanted to happen, should he want that my life was actually meant to ensure that he could move on and do those things. So now I had a considerably shorter to-do list and felt a bit adrift. So, as any married new mother in their 30s would do, I called my mom. And I told her, I said, Mom, I want to talk to you about something. And she said, okay, honey. So I went home to California, we took our newborn, and my mom was sick. She had had a stroke a few years before, and she was dying. And I had had this dream for 30 years, and I didn't know how to tell her that I was giving it up. I wasn't going to do it. And so I sat with her, and I held her hand, on the bed, and she said, but what about your dream? I said, well, I think this is a new dream. And she said, that's great, Nene. That's a great dream. Make that happen. Do something different. And I said, but now what? What do I do? Where's my legacy? How do I know that I've done any of this right and had a life that was worth living now that I'm not going to become the next Supreme Court Justice? And she said, Nene, that you can't always know, that often the ripple effects of your life happen after you're gone, when you're dead. She said, but if you're lucky, you do something in your life and you get to see those effects and you get to see the changes that are being made because you did something. And she said, and because everything we do is in relation to everyone else. We're not these silos. And so I took that as her blessing and ultimately extricated myself from the practice of law and came here, and I started teaching high school English. And I will say this, it is an exponentially harder job. And so I got here, and I was doing this, and I'm surrounded by all these amazing people, administrators, teachers, support, and I thought, this is my nirvana. These are my people. But I realized not yet. I still had some lessons to learn, and of course still do. And my first year, I was coming obviously from an extraordinarily intense corporate environment to an extraordinarily intense academic environment. And I'm butting heads with the students, and it was tough. It was a tough first year. And one particular student was particularly difficult. And he came to class late every day. He talked incessantly. He was often disrespectful to his peers and often disrespectful to me. And by the end of that first year, all I wanted was for him to move on. And he did. And he and I avoided each other our second year like the plague. We visibly sort of looking away. And then his last year, I had proposed a senior elective, and I said, it's called Literature on Trial. And so it's this marrying of the two things that I love most and that I think I do best. And I was so excited for this class. And it's right before it begins, I get the roster, and I look, and lo and behold, this boy's name is on the roster. And I thought for a moment, I'm just gonna go to the registrar and say, he's gotta go. And of course I didn't do that, but I wanted to. Because I thought, this is a kid I can't teach. I can't reach him, I can't teach him, and he's just gonna make my life miserable, and I really just don't want him in my sphere. But he was. And despite the first year we'd had together, despite our mutual avoidance of each other when he was a junior, and despite all of my fears that we were just gonna have a repeat of what we'd had before, this young man did beautifully in my class. And I couldn't believe it. It was as if I was teaching a totally different kid. And that's where the second epiphany came. I was a different boy. Because over the span of that time, over the 2 years since I taught him last, he had made this amazing transformation, as all high schoolers do. And I just didn't know it. And had I given up on him, which I honestly tried to do, I never would have seen that transformation. I would have missed it. And I realized at that moment that I had failed him. I had failed the student because I tried to give up on a kid. And so he did beautifully in the class. It was the impromptu trial skills, and all these skits we did were squarely in his wheelhouse. He was an extremely intelligent young man, so he did beautifully. And so at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, I said to him publicly, in front of his peers, I said, I'm sorry that I failed you. Not literally. Just make sure we're clear on that. I didn't literally fail, but I had given up on him. And I thanked him for giving me a second chance. and offering me an opportunity for redemption. And so graduation, that semester later, he finds me under the tent. And he comes up to me and he says, Mrs. Matthews, thank you. Thank you so much. I never thought I could be a lawyer until I took your class. I never thought I could do all those things you asked of us until I took your class. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thanks for not giving up on me. And it was at that moment that I realized the importance and the power of being a teacher. And every day that I walk into my classroom, I think I'm here to inspire them, and I hear my mother's voice. And I also hear my 8th grade geometry teacher's voice, and I think I will not be that teacher. I will not say off the cuff something that could devastate a young person for the rest of their professional career. And I am graced with the gift to be here every year and teach 50 to 60 kids and touch them and help mold them and form them and watch them go out into the world and see the ripple effects of them changing this world. And I get to say I have a hand in that, even if it's only just a little bit. I'll end with a quote by Henry Adams, who said, "Teachers affect eternity. You never know where your influence stops. You never know who you touch and what they'll do." Every speaker on this stage was inspired by a good teacher. And teaching is the one profession that creates all other professions, because teachers affect eternity. And there's no better legacy than that. Thank you.